Welcome to the Diverse Minds podcast, where we give you the tips, tools and techniques you need to be a mentally healthy and inclusive leader. Each week, you'll hear about a variety of topics linked to mental health, well-being and diversity that will enhance both your professional practice and personal well-being.
Welcome to the 220th episode of the award-winning Diverse Minds podcast. And November is all about parenting with equity and well-being in mind. And our first guest for the series is the brilliant Professor Keon West, someone I have known since my time working at Oxford and someone I'm incredibly proud to know. Keon West is a professor of social psychology who specialises in bias and bias reduction. A fundamentally international thinker, Keon was born in Trinidad, raised in Jamaica and educated at Macalester in Minnesota, USA, the Sorbonne in Paris and Oxford under a Rhodes Scholarship. He works at Goldsmiths, part of the University of London, and he's published over 75 empirical articles, which have been cited over 2,000 times in the wider academic literature. He served on the governing body of multiple national and international psychological societies, including the British Psychological Society and the Society for the Psychological Study of Social Issues, in which he served as president from 2020 to 2021. He's a deep believer in the importance of good science communication, as well as good science in and of itself. Professor West appears regularly on television and radio as an expert on prejudice and improving intergroup relations. He's also the author of two books: one, Skewed, Decoding Media Bias, published by House and currently available on Audible, and two, The Science of Racism, published by Macmillan with an agreed release date in 2025. He is and has always been Black. Keon, a huge welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Layla.
It's such a pleasure to have you, and I think this has been a long time coming, and I've read out your bio, but I think it'd be great for listeners to know what you're working on at the moment.
Okay, so what I'm working on, the thing that is taking up most of my intellectual space, is my latest book. It's called The Science of Racism. It was a provisional title. I think the people at marketing said, we can't use that title because you sound like a Nazi. And I think over time, they just kind of got used to it. They said, actually, it sounds really good and it does explain what the book is about. But it is about racism, in that people talk about racism a lot and often act as if racism is a matter of opinion or a matter of hurt feelings or a matter of perspectives, when actually in many ways there's a lot of science behind it. And there are things that simply aren't a matter of perspective, things that are just scientific, empirical facts. And this book is about those facts. It's not just what we know, it's how we know it. It walks you through the scientific method, makes a case absolutely clearly, says, well, here's what racism looks like, here's how it works, here's how much of it there is, because we can measure it. And if you can measure it, you can say how much there is. And here's what we can do about it. And here's how what we're currently doing about it isn't particularly helpful. And so it spells out all of that. And I am currently in the editing phase. So I've written it. It's been through one or two edits. I'm editing it down. It has to be released contractually early 2025, but there will be copies in existence before that.
That is hugely exciting, and I think it sounds like a brilliant book, and I know some of your work, and it's very exciting. But I also find it really sad that we're still having these conversations, and we still have to have these conversations in this way and talk about racism. And like you said, I think people jump to this whole, but they didn't mean it that way. Oh, look at the two sides to the story. Oh, just to play devil's advocate, blah blah blah. And so I'm really hoping that your book is going to put some of that to bed, or when people read it, they go, oh, actually, yes, it's not about perspective. Here are the hard facts.
Yeah. And there are things, I mean, I could say there are certain places where you can have perspectives. And I think perspectives come into, well, what should we do? And I think, what should we do is always a value-laden question. So should we ban people from doing certain things because they're racist? And I think that always comes with the push and pull of, well, which right do we prioritize? Someone's right to this or someone's right to that? But what really frustrates me is when people say, well, you can't know if any racism happens at all, or that they just flatly claim that none of it happens, or all sorts of things like that, where they ignore that actually we do have so much factual evidence about how much it happens and when it happens and to the extent to which it happens and the strength of it. We know this, and we've known it for so long. So why pretend? And I hope it doesn't actually put the conversation to bed. What I hope it does is wake the conversation up. We've been having the same conversation for hundreds of years, and it's really quite boring. So I want people to start having a new conversation. I'd like them to say, well, now that we know this, how do we align that with our values, and how do we make things better?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Keon. And then thinking about that and thinking about, the fact that you're a parent as well, I keep thinking, actually, I'm always very relieved I don't have children because I don't know how I'd have these conversations. So thinking about the work that you do and your parenting journey so far, how would you summarize the way these two things are overlapping for you?
Yeah, so I had to learn quite a lot for a number of reasons. So I'm a professor of social psychology. I do a lot of research on racism and how racism works, and I publish things on it. And that's important. I do think there is, and I'm not going to be one of those people who says personal experience trumps science. I don't buy that. But I do think it adds quite a lot. It adds a layer of illustration and understanding to the science that you can learn. And reading about racism and doing all of that is incredibly important, but there is another layer of understanding that you get from living through something, which is quite different. The interesting thing for me is that I did not actually grow up as an ethnic minority. I grew up as something else. So I grew up as a Black person. Obviously, I'm Black now. I've always been Black. But I grew up as a Black person in a Black country. And as such, I didn't grow up thinking of myself as a minority in any way. And a lot of my experiences of being minoritized happened later. And then the second thing is that I don't have Black children, or it depends on where I live. So in the United States of America, I would have Black children. But because we live in the UK, I have mixed children. And because they're mixed, their experiences would have been different from mine anyway, growing up quite differently. So I've had to learn a lot. I've really had to put the time and the effort into learning about what racism is like in childhood, because I've only really understood it as a man, as an adult. And those are not quite the same thing.
And I think that is so helpful to think about the different contexts and the assumptions people often make. Because I've got many friends and colleagues like you, a particular friend that I was talking to, and she said, I don't really understand, Layla, when you talk about this kind of having to be an immigrant and getting everything perfect, because I grew up in Nigeria and actually I wasn't very smart. And then I developed a hearing impairment and everyone thought, oh, well, she's really clever because she's trying really hard. And she said, so when people share these experiences with me, I'm like, oh, okay, I don't have that.
Yeah.
So I think it's so important to look at the nuance in someone's lived experience and journey. So thinking about this term anti-racist parenting, what does it mean to you?
Yes. So anti-racist parenting comes with certain assumptions. And I think these assumptions are correct. So I'm going to spell them out explicitly. So the assumption for me is that the world we live in is a racist world, in that in the background, there's a lot of racist stuff happening, and that it's very easy to absorb racist messages. And I think anti-racist parenting, to me, positions itself in contrast, not only with racist parenting, which is obviously bad. I think everyone listening to the podcast probably agrees that that's bad. I think we're all on the same page that racist parenting is bad. But also that non-racist parenting isn't sufficient. That if you simply say, well, I won't raise my child to be racist, that they'll probably still end up racist because of the background racism that's happening. And to give a metaphor for that, like let's say that you're growing up and you're in a family, and for whatever reason, your family is absolutely a Christian family. And it's very important to you that your child grows up a Christian child. Well, then it wouldn't really work if they were fully immersed in the culture of some other religion, like whatever religion that is. So, whether that's Judaism or Islam or anything else, if they're fully immersed in that and you never talk about religion with them and you never pull them deliberately to your side, the child might then just grow up with the ideas of the culture that they live in. And that would be a normal thing. We expect that. And we often see Christian parents in particular reacting very strongly to that. They say they don't want their children to just absorb worldly messages. They want to give them very specific Christian guidance. They want to counter the worldly messages because they know that if you don't counter the messages of the surrounding society, the children absorb them. And no, I'm not actually saying I'm not a Christian parent. I don't do that. But I could understand that if I was a Christian parent, I would want to do that to make sure that my children had my values and not someone else's. And in exactly the same way, I'm not a racist parent. I'm an anti-racist parent. And I know that left to their own devices, the children will absorb the values of the racist society in which they live. And unless I actively do something to counter that, then that's what's going to happen. So it's not enough to be non-racist. You actually have to be anti-racist, or the children will be pulled along by the tide of racism and they will end up being racist anyway.
Mm. And I think this can be a really tricky one, actually, for many South Asian parents. And I'm going to talk about my particular slice of South Asian heritage because we're often double diasporaed. We've come through East Africa, many of us, and I think that we don't have enough of those conversations. And I think we also live, depending on someone's journey, with the different legacies of colonialism, depending on the history of your culture and background. And that's something I think, for my slice of South Asian culture, we are really behind speaking about.
Yeah, I think that can be very difficult. And I think also it's not limited to South Asian culture. So I think, like I said, I didn't grow up an ethnic minority. So I grew up as a majority Black person in a majority Black Caribbean country. And many of my contemporaries as well, people who would be called Black or who would be called brown sometimes in Jamaica or something else, really approach it with a mindset of, well, we're just not going to worry about that. We're better than that. And the strategy is just overperformance, that will just be really great, ignore it. It's not a real issue. And then sometimes there's also a very ugly ambivalence about racism, which can also make these conversations very difficult. And by ambivalence, I mean sometimes ethnic minorities buy into racist messages, that we accept that ethnic minorities are worse in some ways, that they're lazy or criminal or something else, or that white people are prettier or more deserving of attention or something of the sort. And that makes it really hard for us to overcome those things entirely. But I do think it's helpful to just really break down what the messages are, how they're coming through, how clearly we can see that they're coming through, and what effect they have on us and on our children. And once we do that, I think it makes the fight a bit clearer and a bit easier to take on.
Yeah, that's really, really helpful. And so, what do you think then are the biggest challenges in talking with children? And it depends on the child, it depends on cultures, there's a lot there, but about racism, but also anti-racism. And I think for me, one of the reasons I've definitely shied away from parenting is because I just thought I don't know, I've still got so much baggage myself, how I would have conversations if my child had experienced racism.
Well, I think before I give any of the official kind of scientific answer, I would first like to say that sometimes I think that, as with any other kind of power structure, it's the same with parenting, that it is exactly the people who say, I'm not sure I should be a parent, who would probably be the best parents. And the people who are hungry for it, we might want some caution around them, because it is a real position of power and authority. And I do think that your position of humility and caution is such a brilliant place to come from. And I wish other people came from that place. So that's very important. But when you say, what's the biggest impediment? The biggest impediment to talking about racism is, in my opinion, and it is an opinion, but it is a well-informed scientific opinion, I would say, is without a doubt the parents. The parents are the biggest issue. Parents have several ideas that are absolutely erroneous, that are simply incorrect, and that they then push onto the children, and they impede the discussion of things like racism. So the first one is that children are simply too young to discuss racism. And this is absolutely not true. There is no science anywhere that supports the idea that your child is too young to talk about racism. If they are old enough to talk to you about anything, they are probably already old enough to talk to you about racism. There was really interesting research that was done by Professor Adam Rutland and some of his colleagues. And this dates back to 2005 now. So it's a bit of an older study, but there have been studies that have been done much more recently in both the UK and the US, recently, like 2019, I think, although I should look up the exact dates. But I like to cite Adam's study because I know Adam personally, and he's a nice guy, also a white guy, which I guess is relevant for some people. But he ran a series of studies on British children in particular. And the studies were quite clever in that they presented images of children who were matched for things like age and gender and attractiveness. So they kind of pre-rated all the children to make sure that they matched on all these things, except that some of them were white and some of them were Black and some of them were Asian. And they handed out the pictures of these children to real children, British 3 to 5-year-olds, and asked them to assign adjectives to the children. So they could assign nice adjectives like nice, or like kind, or like smart, or bad adjectives like mean, nasty, and lazy. And all the experimenters had to do was count up the nice ones and count up the bad ones. And then they could determine whether there was any pattern, whether some children were getting more nice things than other children. And this won't surprise you, but what happened was that these British children, these 3 to 5-year-olds, were routinely assigning significantly more positive things to the white children than to the ethnic minority children. And they did this in a reliable pattern. And it was very much white children, Asian children, Black children. And it was in that ratio where white children were clearly on top, Asian children in the middle, Black children at the bottom. And there are other studies that find very similar things, other studies that don't have to be nearly as clever, that just ask children, how do you feel about ethnic minorities? And the great thing about children is that they're a lot less savvy than adults. They'll just tell you. They'll just tell you Asians are not to be trusted. They'll just tell you Black people are not attractive. They'll just say that. It's only when we get older that we learn we're not supposed to say those things. And then we do this kind of social norms dance. But children are great for researchers in some ways because they're just openly racist. And no research anywhere suggests that a 3-year-old is too young to talk about racism. In fact, what the research suggests is that 3-year-olds, unless something special has happened, are already almost certainly racist, that they have already absorbed the racial hierarchy of the society in which they live, and they're perfectly capable of reproducing it. So the question then is, given that they're so early to the game, that this is already happening, how long should we wait before we talk about it? And the frightening thing is that many parents wait an incredibly long time until children are teenagers. And if you wait until your child is 13, let's say, which many people do, and the science shows that they've already absorbed racist ideas by 3, that is 10 years to just let those ideas percolate safely. Just letting them sit there, just letting them absorb them and believe them and have them totally unchallenged and totally unexamined for 10 solid years. And then when they're 13, when they're least likely to listen to you anyway, because they've already decided that you're stupid and lame and, mommy and daddy don't know anything after all and your politics are all wrong, then you think you're going to talk to them about racism. And that is a terrible idea. It's stupid. It's too late. Do not do that. So start much earlier. And then the second problem, which I'm going to, again, squarely put with the parents, is that the approach so many parents use is a colorblind approach. And this comes out in words like, well, we just try to treat everybody equally, or they don't actually mention race or racism at all. They just say vague statements of positivity, like we should treat everyone with respect, or our goal is just to treat everyone well. But this isn't helping, right? This is not addressing racism. This is just being colorblind. And most white people, less so at ethnic minorities do not tend to agree with this as much. But most white people think colorblindness is a good idea. They think it's a great strategy. They really like it. It is their preferred strategy for dealing with diversity, with racial and ethnic diversity. But research shows it is a bad strategy, that colorblindness is associated with higher levels of explicit bias, explicit racism, implicit racism, with lower interest in activities that do anything about racism. So a higher level of opposition to things like Black Lives Matter protests or affirmative action or anything of the sort. And so if you're encouraging colorblindness, not only are you having this conversation too late, it'd actually be better if you just didn't do that, because the colorblindness increases all the racist things, and we don't want these racist things to increase. So do not have it that way if you're going to have the discussion. And so I'd say those would be my 2 things. The problems are the parents. The kids can handle the conversations, and the kids can manage them in a way that's more nuanced and more realistic than the colorblind approach that's often given. We just don't give them the benefit of the doubt. We never assume that they can do that, and that's the problem.
And the same with and you can look at the 2 misogynistic ideals formed at a very young age. There's been some really interesting videos which I'm sure you're aware of about that, and how people play with female children, or children they assume to be female and children they assume to be male, from like 1 year old. So I think that whole point about colorblindness, I had a really interesting conversation in a training session about a year ago, and it just really stayed with me, because actually it was a huge light bulb moment for me. And this delegate said, those of us who grew up in the 80s and 90s in the UK, we were told that to talk about race is rude. So what you've just said, and to talk about color is rude. And now these people who might be in academia, who might be mid to senior academics, are saying, well, we were told that was rude, but now you're telling me to not ask people where they're from, but to talk about race. I can't win, I give up. So I think there's a really big piece here around shifting, isn't there? About shifting. And I always talk about not pushing the private into the public, but having conversations where you can start to understand and empathize without, you don't have to go up to someone you don't know and get your microphone out and ask them invasive journalistic questions. There are lots of people who do this for their job, and there is lots of information out there. And I totally agree. I feel like young people and children are very willing to have conversations, and actually there's ways you can do it quite creatively as well.
Yes, absolutely. And I'd like to say 2 points. So the first one is that you said it's true about misogyny as well. So everything I say is true about other things. So by the age of 3, not only have children absorbed really racist ideas, they've absorbed hideously sexist ideas. And they will just tell you, they'll tell you these ideas. They'll say, mummies don't work, daddies work. They'll just say that, which is great. But I'm talking about racism, but I want it to be taken as read that essentially everything I say about racism is quite similar, if not the same, but it's quite similar for other forms of bias. Because this is how bias works. And we have a kind of a bias way of working as human beings. And once you figure out the patterns, you can start applying it to other things. But on the subject of the color blindness, I do empathize to some extent because they're right. I remember, I think, and I'm always worried I'm getting this one wrong, but I think it was an In Vogue song. Does anyone remember In Vogue? They were like an all-black women's group.
Yeah, I do.
There was
Yeah.
that free your mind and the rest will follow, be colorblind. They were black people who were saying be colorblind. And I grew up in the 80s and I remember people saying you should be colorblind. But I also remember growing up in the 80s and being told that Pluto was a planet. And now I'm being told it's not a planet. And I've met very few people who've got really angry at astronomers and said, well, you told me Pluto was a planet and now you're saying it's not a planet. I can't win. I'm like, just shut up. I mean, it's not that hard. Science moves forward. We tried that. We saw the effects of it. It didn't work. And we now have decades of data to show it's a terrible idea. And it's odd that I don't feel the same vitriol towards the people. And maybe there's a staunch Pluto corner of the internet somewhere that I'm missing. But I don't see people reacting like that. They just say, oh, we learn new things about Pluto. Actually, it's smaller than we thought. In fact, there are other celestial bodies that are similar to it in terms of size and orbit. It's not a planet. And everyone just moves on. And in the same way, we did the color blindness. We saw what happened, and it results in increases in bias. We can see that it pushes both implicit and explicit racism upwards. So it might have been well-intentioned, but it doesn't work. We can stop now. I don't know why that's a complicated message.
Again, I think for me, it's about the discomfort that people don't want to feel. So it's easier to say, let's be colorblind and not talk about it. When you've not experienced racial discomfort over and over again, you don't want to go there because it feels so alien to you. That's my hypothesis on it anyway.
Yes, I could see that makes sense, that if your goal isn't actually to do anything about racism, but to immediately increase your own personal comfort with the situation, then yes, colorblindness does work very well, much in the way that ignoring any problem would make it feel like it's going away. So, it's easier just to stop thinking about your diet than to change your diet. It's easier to just stop thinking about certain pains you're experiencing in your stomach or in your knee than to do anything about them. But we understand that as adults, this is a bad long-term strategy, that ignoring problems does not, in fact, make them go away. I mean, anyone who suggested this for any other area of life, I think would be treated with immediate suspicion. If you went to the doctor and they said, just don't think about it. Or if you went to a marriage counselor and they said, no, don't pay attention to it when your husband does that. That lipstick on his collar, don't think about it. It's fine. Just don't think about that. This wouldn't work. And so I think as adults, we have to do the same thing when it comes to racism. Like, yes, it might offer immediate comfort, but as a long-term strategy, we've known for some time it's ineffective.
And then thank you, that brings me to talk about workplaces a little bit. And I think that, we know we have a huge working population of parents. And what do you think workplaces could do to understand the needs of parents, not just talking about equality and equity in the workplace, but actually in the home space as well, and making a way for parents to do that in the workplace?
I think that's such an interesting question. So off the top of my head, I would say I'm not actually sure to what extent we can expect workplaces to do that, in large part because they've never done this. It's not something that they've ever fundamentally committed to. And not just about racism, but about many, many things. So workplaces today still don't offer certain basic equalities. One of the easiest examples I like to reach for is parental leave, whereby in the developed world, is what we like to call it, most countries still do not offer basic gender parity for parental leave. And so I think asking how these companies can then help us learn more about this is a bit like, it's a bit like asking how a fast food chain can help us learn more about healthy eating. I think they can do that. I don't think they're motivated to. I'm not sure they see it as their job, and I'm not sure if I would trust them to do that. I actually see us as having to settle into the comforting position, or the less comforting position of understanding that they're probably not on our side, and that we have to very, very actively be aware of what's going on. Now, that said, some workplaces can do this, particularly if they are children oriented and if they are dealing with our children. So I think as a basic thing, I think anyone who teaches children should know some of this basic stuff. So when you go to nurseries and to schools and to universities, and I know by the time you're in a university, you're not a child anymore, but you're not really an adult, not fundamentally. And I think anyone involved in those spaces should know at the very least the basics of what racism is, like what scientific tests we do to know that it occurs, what evidence there is that it's happening and how much of it is happening. So for example, one study that I thought was really interesting was a study of preschool teachers or something to that effect. So people who were teaching children who are about 5 years old, so very young children. And for this study, they attached some eye tracking glasses to them and they showed them some videos. And they said, we just want you to look at these videos and to point out as soon as you can when challenging behavior occurs. So that they're looking for bad behavior from the children. And they have these glasses on. And the interesting thing about the experiment was that there was no bad behavior of any kind. The children all behaved really, really well, and nobody ever noticed any bad behavior. So that wasn't what was happening. But the purpose of the eye tracking glasses was to check who they were looking at when the experimenters told them to look out for the challenging behavior. And when the experimenters didn't mention challenging behavior, they just kind of looked around the classroom. When they said, look out for the challenging behavior, the teachers predominantly looked at the Black children, in particular the Black boys, who weren't doing anything. But this highlights one of the ways in which we bring the biases to the table. And it makes certain things less mysterious. It's like, Black children, in particular Black boys, they face more disciplinary action, particularly for similar behaviors to white children, and they're more likely to have trouble in school in that way. And it's very clear that this is something teachers are looking for and that they do expect and that they respond differently to. And so, I kind of think of it almost the other way, that when it comes to my children, I tell them about these things, not so that they should, be permanently angry at their teachers, but that they should understand that the world doesn't work the way that they're being told it works. It doesn't work that if you behave exactly like the white children, you will get exactly the same outcomes. Nothing in the science suggests that that's the case. It suggests that if you behave exactly like the white children, your outcomes will be measurably worse. And we can give percentages to how much worse and in what area. And so you have to know this in order to navigate the system effectively.
Thank you. And I'm thinking as well about maybe in certain workplaces, there might be certain staff networks that can hold space for these conversations. Maybe that's as close as we're going to get to it right now.
Well, I think those are good ideas. I see those as spaces of resistance. And I think that, I don't want it to be always an us versus them. I mean, I'll put my cards on the table. I'm married to a white person. So I don't think they're all our enemies. I don't think that's how it works. But I do think that we have to be aware that the system in which we live is not a system in which ethnic minority effort is equally rewarded and ethnic minority behavior is equally punished. It's just not true. And once we understand that, then we can build spaces to make it more true. But we're fighting against a system that doesn't necessarily want that change to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. Because why would you want to give up that power?
Yeah.
So, Keon, this is a lot. This is a lot. You're having these conversations, you're holding space, you're thinking about these things, you're writing a book. So how do you look after your own mental health? What are your top 3 tips?
So that is an interesting question. I would like to say to everyone, whatever color you may be, that I don't believe that you should have to be on the front line all the time. This is actually not advice that I came up with in any sense. I owe this advice to one of my own professors when I was an undergraduate. I did mine in the US, which was quite a learning experience. And I mean, this is a much longer story, but I came to the US so racist, which is hilarious because, like I said, I am a Black person and have always been. But I grew up a majority Black person. And where I grew up, working hard did result in positive outcomes. Behaving in the same way as everyone else did result in the same disciplinary outcomes. So I always thought the world was fair and everything was going great. And then I went to the US and it was such a culture shock that people responded with fear when I was doing nothing scary, with confusion when I said perfectly normal things, with the signs of being impressed that made it very clear that they had incredibly low expectations. I would say very normal sentences. And I would hear, ad nauseum, how, oh my goodness, you're very articulate. And I would just kind of laugh at that. I think, what did you expect me to say? So I had to learn a lot of things when I arrived at the US. And when I got there, one of my professors, Kendrick Brown at Macalester, I spoke to him because he was one of the Black professors and he had dreadlocks, and they're a minority. And who else are you going to speak to? Which is added work for him that the white professors did not have. I acknowledge that, but who else are you going to speak to? And I said, this is really tiring and I don't want to do this anymore. And he said, just stop. You don't have to be on the front line. Racism will still be there tomorrow. I promise you. You can go and fight it again. And there is nothing to be proved by burning yourself out. That you fight a bit and you step back. That's how people do it in actual wars. They do not leave soldiers on the front line forever because they burn out and they die. And we don't want that. We want you to take care of yourself and to come back. And so I recommend doing that. In my personal life, I try to think of it as much as possible as a thing that can be controlled. So there's a lot of research on employment discrimination, for example. And this research looks like taking like a couple hundred or a couple thousand CVs and changing the names on the CVs. So you have, a white name, or you have like a Muslim name, or you have a Black name. And I understand that Muslim is not a racial category, but also in a lot of research, it's treated like one because people are not responding fundamentally to your deeply held beliefs about the truth of Islam or Allah. They are responding to your name and your face and your dress. And so in a lot of ways, it functions like a racial category. So I have to make that clear. But they replace a white name with a Black name or a Muslim name or some other kind of name. And you can just see the callback rates drop the moment you do that. So, white people get 100 responses. Then the Asians will get like 80 responses, and the Black people and the Muslims get like 50, and it will just drop. And there are other studies that show very similar things. And so I see that as terrible and painful, but I also see it as countable and measurable. And because I do the science around it, I can see that the employment discrimination rate for someone like me is about 36 to 51%. Which means I only have to be about 36 to 51% better than the white people I'm competing with, and I'm a shoo-in. And I know that's a lot of extra work, but it's a measurable amount of extra work. Like, I can do that. I think I can just be 36 to 51% better than them. I think I have the capacity to do that. Whereas if it was an unmeasurable amount or an immeasurable amount, I would find that to be too intimidating. So I think drawing barriers around it and saying, well, I can protect myself in this way, I can accomplish that, is quite good. But I also think having a network of people you can talk to and people who are on your side make it easier. So I don't try to take on everything alone. There are people who I can talk to, people who I can work with, people who are on my side, some of whom are white, some of whom are other ethnic minorities. And as much as I can, I do that for other people. So I don't allow bizarre racist things to happen in my workplace to people who are less powerful than myself. I step in at that point because I have the power. So I'm Kendrick Browning the situation. I'm taking on extra work in that case, but it's work that I can afford to take on. It's work that my shoulders can bear and theirs can't. And I don't leave my children to handle it alone. So I listen to what's happening at school. And if one comes home and says, well, the children were laughing at me because they say I have curly whirly hair and straight hair is better, or, that I shouldn't have brown skin or whatever else it is, then I go in and I make sure I have a conversation with those teachers and whoever else it is. And the children don't have to deal with that by themselves. And I hope that they can see that behavior in how we can support each other, that when you get strong enough, you don't let other people take it on alone.
Oh, thank you so much, Keon. And I always love asking that question because everyone has such a different perspective and helpful tips. So finally, if people want to know more about your work, they want to read your papers, they want to read what you're doing, and I will, of course, include these on the show notes. What are your links or your contact methods?
Yeah, so the easiest way to find me is probably still via X, although I'm not on it anymore. I just feel like I got a lot of strange right-wing content after a while, and so I've been on it less. But if you do want to find me on it, you can find me on it as just Prof Keon West, and that's it. If you want to find my website, it's just keonwest.com or keonwest.co.uk. Those work really, really well. Oh, yes. And also the last thing I would say, in response to that last question, sometimes you can handle it by actually taking a step back and doing something else entirely that you find really, really fun. So a lot of my research is about bias and discrimination, and really, really depressing things. But then about almost 10 years ago now, I just woke up and said, I'm not going to do that forever. I'm going to start doing other things too. So then I started researching other things, just random things that made me happier. And I would say this is also an option. Like, just go out, be happy, go to the park, go to the beach, do something else. Like, don't drown yourself in being unhappy. Like, it will be there tomorrow. So be as happy as you can, take a deep breath, and then go back into the fight.
Thank you. That's a beautiful way to end. And I can't thank you enough. And as I said at the beginning, I'm so proud to call you my friend. I'm so honored. And I honestly am honored. And obviously I've followed your work for a while, and well, since your PhD days, and it's just such an honor. And thank you so much for sharing your time and wisdom with us today.
Oh, thank you very much. I do appreciate that. And it's an honor to be your friend, and it's an honor to be here.
Oh, thank you so much, and take care, everyone. And please keep joining us on this series where we're going to be talking about equity, mental health and well-being, and anti-racism in parenting. Until then, see you next time.
Thanks for listening to the Diverse Minds podcast. Don't forget to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you access your podcasts from. You can also connect with me on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Tune into next week's episode of the podcast, where I'll bring you more insights on mental health and inclusion. Bye for now.